All right, and so to catch up last week or this last Sunday, what we did was, as we're walking through the promises, we've gotten through the land been fulfilled, the nation's been fulfilled. We got to David, and remember we talked about we're just going to go through now trying to get to the blessing, which is Jesus, and how he comes onto the scene, and it's the last fulfillment of the promises that were made to Abraham. And so we're not going to cover all the different details that happen throughout the Bible. We're just going through that one thread to get through the lineage to get to Jesus and to see how all that works out. Now, with that, we'll see some prophecies along the way that have taken place. And after David, he says there's going to be someone on the throne forever. Well, that's going to happen, and we're going to see that with Samuel. So in 2 Kings, you look at 2 Kings chapter 2. And now this gets pretty interesting here because I'm sorry, 1 Kings 2. No wonder you guys are still flipping around. 1 Kings 2. I'm seeing 2, and so I'm just going with that. But it's 1 Kings chapter 2. So now, in chapter 2, verse 2, he says, I am to go the way of the earth. So David's about to die, and he says, be strong and show yourself a man. And to keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking the ways and keeping his statutes and commandments, his rules and his testimonies. As is written in the law of Moses, you shall prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. And may the Lord, and the Lord may establish his word that he has spoken concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And so this is his instruction as he is going to be dying soon. He gives this to Solomon. Now, Solomon, at this point, he ends up becoming king. And if you go to chapter 3, what's the one thing that we remember about his, his infancy of being a king? The beginning. When God asked him, wisdom. He asked for wisdom, right? He could have asked for all these things, but he asked for wisdom. I remember, and I think I've told you guys before, when I was asked at 5 years old in my kindergarten class what I wanted, I said all the gum in the world. Now, I don't know why, but that's what I wanted. I wanted all the gum in the world. Any gum that you might have eaten or chewed, I wanted all. Well, he had wisdom enough to ask for wisdom. Now, it says from this, he ends up being one of the wisest, or the wisest man, right? Well, now, what does it say in James about how we get wisdom? What's that? Yeah, we ask, right? And it comes from above. Now, James chapter 1, verse 5. Hold your spot where you're at and then turn to James if you would, because there's something I want to mention about it. So in James chapter 1, verse 5, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom. Well, I'm sure we could all use a little bit more, couldn't we? And if you answer no, then that means you lack it to begin with, because we all need some of that. And it says, if we need it, in verse 5, who are we supposed to be asking? We're supposed to be asking God, aren't we? Now, the amazing thing, it says, who gives, and the key word is generously. Does anybody have another word beside generously? Liberally. Man, do you like someone that gives to you liberally? Oh, yeah. I mean, we love that. And so to give generously to all without reproach, and it'll be given to him. So if we ask, he will out of his overabundance, he will give us wisdom. So we should be in every prayer. We should be asking for more wisdom, shouldn't we?
But there is a condition on that in verse 6.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Read that if you would.
But let him ask in faith, with no doubt. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind.
So if we ask in faith and not doubt, he's going to be generous to give us wisdom. And these other things. Now, look and see what wisdom is. James chapter 3, verse 17. This wisdom is different than the wisdom of the world. Completely different. You talk about these wise political guys. They're able to stay in power after all these years and stuff. And if you looked theirs would probably be from verse 16. You know, jealousy and selfish ambition and disorder and vile practice and all. But in verse 17, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Man, that's the good stuff. And if we pray, he's going to give it to us. And so we should do more of that than asking for the other things we're asking for, because that would give us the discernment to know right from wrong, the discernment of making the best choice, kind of that good, better, best aspect. So going back to 1 Kings, we see he's told one thing in chapter 2 is be faithful. That's what he's chosen. That's what's given. Be faithful. That's the command. And so in chapter 3, he obviously listened to that because he wants wisdom. So he can be faithful. Now, we could go in and talk about all the other stuff that he did, but if you go to chapter 6, you look in verse 38, it talks about him building the temple in 7 years. So he builds that, and now no longer is there a tabernacle, a tent that can be taken down and shifted around like they did for 40 years. And it's been continuing to go on until this day when he's able to do that. If you recall, David couldn't do it because there was blood on his hands. But Solomon, he was the one able to do it. So King David got all the materials set up. So all Solomon had to do was just carry out the orders. He had all the plans there at his disposal, plus the resources. Now, then look over in 11. Now he's going to be the wisest man. And God blesses him with even more. Now, and we've mentioned this time and time again about how important it is to find the right person. Not, it's one of those things to be equally yoked. It talks about also that if you are good morals and you're with someone who isn't, then all of a sudden from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I believe verse 58, it says it corrupts you. And so looking here, we've seen a lot of people corrupted by who they married. Now, I don't say that to down or diss anybody on the choices they've made. But look at what Solomon, and the reason I mention this is because he's the wisest man. So he knew better. And how many times do we know better and we still do stuff? You think about maybe just this past year, things you knew better and you still did it. I'll give you a lesson that has nothing to do with the sin. But I remember my head coach, I was coaching at the time, and he said, you never put a different team in for punt team. You don't do that. When you just keep that defense out there. And the reason is because if they try to fake it, your defense is ready and set. So I remember him instilling this over and over again. And I'm working with the JV guys, and then on varsity night, I'd help out there. And I had all my guys set up exactly the way I was taught. But all of a sudden, it's fourth down. He says, punt team, get out there. And I'm looking like, what just happened? Because that's not what you're supposed to do. So guess what happened? They ran a fake. And it was a 30-yard gain. And so then later in the game, they had another one. And he said, punt team, get out there. And guess what? They made another touchdown. Because they ran another fake. They had 3, maybe even 4 fakes. And they were huge gains. And I was just looking at my head coach, who is always really hot and angry. And just looking at him thinking, that's crazy because you know better. And if you know better, the old saying is you need to do better. And so there's some wisdom that we have that we just don't lean on at times. Well, look what he does. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now, right there, that's just unwise. When it says many, right? 700. Yeah. And then how many concubines? Because that's in that same verse.
300.
Yeah. So she's looking at verse 3, 700 women, wives, and then 300 concubine, 1,000 women. Now, when I was in Tanzania, I remember driving by and I saw all these huts that were set up. And I was like, is that just another village? And the guy said, oh, no, that's all his wives. Every little hut is his wife. And I was like, are you kidding? And so they have their own little individual families. And he's got a multitude. And that's how a man in Tanzania from the Maasai, or for the Maasai tribe, that's how they view themselves as, yes, I have arrived. If I had the more women that I have, that means the more land I can farm, and so that means the wealthier I am. So it's a status. So it says, loved all these women. Now the interesting thing is, look, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, there was Moabite, there was Ammonite, there was Edomite, Sidonian, and then Hittite. And so, did any of these come from Israel? Yeah, none of them did. So now he is doing something that's going to hurt him. It said, these nations concern the Lord, in verse 2, said to the people of Israel. So he told the people of Israel, including him, you shall not enter into marriage with them. Neither shall they with you. For they will, and here's the whole key, it has nothing to do with foreign women. We've talked about that as Numbers 12 talks about how Moses was with a Cushite, which is present-day Ethiopian. It had nothing to do with color, nothing to do with skin tone. It was all about faith. And it says, for they will surely turn your heart away after other gods. But it says Solomon clung to these in love. So he disobeyed God, and he clung. Those ladies were more important than God. And so he was in love with God, in love with self, instead of the God. And so it mentions, as Shirley talked about, the 700 wives, 300 concubines. And it said, and these wives turned away his heart. In verse 4, for when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David. Now we know David messed up, right? But the difference we see, when David messed up, he worked hard at getting it right. When Solomon was messing up, and he's wiser than David, he continued down that path. And I would say he didn't just continue, he just ran after it. And so that should be something for us that we take note of, that if we're setting ourselves up for failure or we're setting ourselves up for success. But it's us who are the ones that are setting ourselves up. And so here it says in verse 9, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. How many times has God appeared to you? I don't know how a life-changing experience like that would have been, but it mentions it twice. That the Lord spoke to him twice. Now, I would remember it, I would recall it, and I would probably, in reverence, talk about it. And here it is, appeared to him twice, and yet, as Shirley just said, man, there's 700 and there's 300. You got 1,000. And so he didn't think about that. And it says, and he, who appeared to him twice in verse 10, and he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Now, do you think that he just quickly, this was a overnight type of thing where he started worshiping other gods overnight? No, that's that gradual thing, isn't it? And it's in our lives, it's gradual. I mean, we don't get to where we are spiritually, whether it be in a strong place or a weak place overnight. It's a slow process. And so, sin just kind of creeps in just a little bit, right? All of those things, all the different things that we struggle with. You think about there's not, 20 million sins that you struggle with. There's probably 4 or 5 that you struggle with that may be different than everybody else, and it may be the same. But if you identified and you were just going to write down the big things that get you, there's only just 4 or 5, I'd imagine. But you let those 4 or 5 just start planting its seed, and you get further and further down the road. And we talked about that 1 degree of separation. That's what's happened to him. It wasn't just one woman, and all of a sudden he's like, yep, I'm following you. It was over a period of time. And so it says in verse 11, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my commandments and my statutes that I've given you, I will tear the kingdom from you, and I'll give it to your servant. Yet, and here's the key, because God keeps his promises. And that's the reason why we're covering this is because I need you to know why it ends up happening and why he stays true. Yet, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it in your days. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. So he says, as long as you're there, it'll be stable. And to me, that hurts more, wouldn't it? Because your kid's suffering for what you've done. Who would be willing to sacrifice anything for their kid, right? But yet he's going to say, no, don't worry about this. I'm going to take it and I'm going to hurt your son. Ooh, man, I'm going to tear it out of his hands. That's going to be difficult, right? So he's going to have to deal with that. But he remembers the promise. It's all about David. And so he says he's going to tear the kingdom, but he's not going to take it fully away. And so we see that there is one in verse 31 named Jeroboam. Yes.
I'm really puzzled by that. You do anything for your kid, I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
But the punishment seems a little harsh in that sense, because you're punishing the one that did it.
Well,
You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, but wait till you get to what he does, and then you'll say, man, he did it to himself. But God's going to allow it to happen here, the next generation. But I know what you're saying, but then when you start seeing what Rehoboam does, oh man, you start thinking, yeah, he's very similar to his dad. You've heard that you're a chip off the old block before, right? Rehoboam is a chip. And let's look at it. All right, so, and thank you very much for bringing that up, because that's a segue into it. Verse 31, he says to Jeroboam, he says, take yourself 10 pieces. Now, what happens is, there's a prophet in verse 29. It's a Haggai, I don't know, I'm guessing. And he says, he goes, and this prophet, he tears up his garment into 12 pieces. And in verse 31, he tells Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, because I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and I'll give you 10 tribes. So he's going to get all these tribes, and then it says, but we have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me and worshipped, and they're talking about all these gods, and they didn't keep the statutes. But what he's saying is Judah is going to be spared. So Judah is going to stay under there. And the reason why it's so important is because that's where David is from. He's from the tribe of Judah, and that's where Jesus is supposed to come from, right? So he's keeping that pure. And so you can see that no matter what we do, God's plan's still going to come about. He's going to twist it and work it out no matter what we do to try to destroy it and mess it up. And so this is where we get the 10 tribes. So now go into chapter 12. And this ends up with the part that was the question, why would God do this? And so in chapter 12, we have, now this is interesting because all of a sudden in verse 2, once Rehoboam is king. Now all of a sudden Jeroboam comes in and he's okay to return because he'd been fleeing, verse 2, from King Solomon. Solomon wanted to kill him when he found out that he was going to get everything, and so he'd been running away. Now it says, verse 6, then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father. And he says, how do you advise me to answer this people? And they said, in verse 7, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. So he just says, serve them. That servant leadership that Jesus did. Serve them and see what happens. They'll serve you forever. They'll go wherever you want. But he abandoned the counsel of the old men, very similar to his dad. This is the reason why I mentioned chip off the old block, because his dad had all kinds of wisdom, but quit listening to it. Quit taking his own wisdom that he had. Now, he had some wise people around him that Rehoboam was surrounded with, and he abandoned that counsel that the old men took and took the counsel with the young men. Now, we've seen that before, right? When the old men give counsel, but then the young people are listened to, that usually is not good advice given. Why is old better than young? You've got some perspective. You've got some wisdom. You've got some experience.
And that's where God told us.
Yeah. But he just shows you the foolishness here. He says he abandoned the counsel of the old men and gave counsel and took the counsel of the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. And he said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him said, thus shall you speak to the people who said to you. And he says, this is how you're supposed to do it. Your father made your yoke heavy, but you lightened it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. Oh, so in other words, you thought it was tough. Man, I'm going to bring it. Now I'm just going to bring it all. And all that does is that totally turns people away. And so now it's interesting when this took place in verse 12. So Rehoboam and all the people came to Jeroboam came with all the people to Rehoboam on the third day as the king came. As the king said, come to me again on the third day. But he spoke harshly to him, forsaking the counsel of the old people. So even Jeroboam was all in until this takes place. And then it says in verse 15, so the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that where he fulfilled his word, by which the word spoke from the prophet. And so he listens to foolishness, and so God's now going to teach a lesson. You get to be king, but of this province, because you don't deserve to be king over the whole thing. So the kingdom is divided, and then it talks about verse 21. Judah and Benjamin stay with the king. The rest of them leave and they form Israel, which is already there existing, and Jeroboam is over them. Now, we're not going to get too in depth on the kings of Israel. They're usually mostly, I think every one of them actually is bad. But looking at this is how they get started off. And so it talks about in verse 26 of chapter 12. Now Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. So he's all about reform and doing that. But then in verse 28, the king took some counsel. And when he takes counsel, he's just like Rehoboam. He takes foolish counsel. So what does he make? Golden calves. Haven't we seen this story before? Yep. Haven't we seen how this thing played out before? These people know their history, but yet they're continuing to repeat their history. He makes 2 golden calves, and the reason why is he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Because he didn't want them going to worship at the temple because he thought they wouldn't serve him as a king. So his insecurity and his jealousy and his wanting power, he decides to make things that they can worship there. So you don't need to go anywhere else. And by doing this, he also appoints in verse 31 temples on high places. And this is the first time we see these temples, the high places that one of theirs has set up. This has been something in the past that people that worship foreign gods would do, but it's the first time we see that one of God's people is doing this.
Doesn't he give them that calf? And he said, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt.
That's what it says in verse 28, isn't it?
He didn't give God the credit.
Sure didn't. And
It's a wonder he didn't get smoked right there.
And, because God was pretty upset the first time, right? And so that he appoints priests in verse 31. And where were they not from? What tribe were they not from? They weren't from the Levites. That's the only place you're supposed to get them. So he has done away with everything. He's created his own priesthood now. And so they're going to be loyal to him. So he's done all these things. Now, it gets pretty bad. And if he had taken other advice, it might have worked out better for him. Now, look at, let's see, verse 33, let's see. No, let's go to chapter 13. Now, this is just going to be interesting here, because we're not going to cover it for maybe a couple Sundays. But in verse 2, who is prophesied that's coming from the house of David? Josiah. That's going to be a big name. Josiah is going to be the last king, because after him, Judah is going to go into Babylonian captivity. And he says, he shall sacrifice sacrifice on you the priests of the high places. So he is going to make an end to this. He's going to take it back to God. And so it's prophesied long ago, before anybody is even thinking the name Josiah. And that's interesting, because he comes about and just tells you, God can tell you by name what's going to happen. And we're going to forget about it, and it's still going to happen. So when this takes place, look in chapter 14. Look in, let's look in verse 8. He talks about, I exalted you. And in verse 8 it says, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And yet you have not been like my servant David. You have kept, who kept my commandments and followed me with all my heart, doing only which is right in my eyes. You've done evil above all who were before you, and have gone and made yourself other gods and metal images, provoking me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. Therefore, behold, I will bring you harm upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will burn up the house of Jeroboam as a man burns up dung until it's all gone. And so he mentions that. And it says, anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, in the city, the dog shall eat. Anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of heaven will eat. For the Lord has spoken. In other words, no one's going to be buried, because you're not good enough to be for that. Because everybody went along with him too. It's not just what he said. Everybody followed suit. And he says, therefore, it says, arise, therefore, and go to your house. When your feet enter the city, the child shall die. And so he's talking about his own child will end up dying. And so as it goes on, it says, and all of Israel shall mourn for him and bury him. And he only of Jeroboam shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something pleasing to the Lord. So when this takes place, it takes place is exactly what he said. Go to chapter 15. And look in verse 25. Let's see. Look at verse 29. as soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed until he had destroyed it, according to the word the Lord had spoken by him by this prophet. And so it actually happened the way God said it. And, when he goes into the town, his child does die. And so everything was because he rebelled against God. And so when you look at it, God still has the same amount of patience with us and the same amount of seriousness with us. He still expects us to do right. Now, when this happens, you could go to chapter 14, verse 17, and you could see that that child does die when he comes in. So you can see that that's fulfilled. Now, when this is taking place, look, while this is happening, we're going to go back to Judah. And in chapter 14, verse 22, it says, Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Have you ever been in a situation where there's just not one good thing? Seems like it came from the day. Everything, all the news you heard was nothing but bad. Because I've had a lot of days as assistant principal like that. I mean, you hear all of a sudden this person's under the influence. All of a sudden this person left campus without permission. All of a sudden you got an angry parent here. All of a sudden there's a gas smell. All these different things take place, and it's just one thing after another. And you're thinking, how in the world? Well, that's exactly what seems to be taking place. Israel is sinning. Judah is sinning. Everybody is. And it says they provoked him to jealousy with their sins, talking about God, with the sins they committed, more than all that their fathers had done. So now he's saying, Jeroboam, you are the worst that anybody in Israel's been. And now Rehoboam, you're the worst in Judah that's been before you. And here's what he's done. Look in chapter 14. Look in verse 24. To me, this is pretty wild. This is in Judah, where they would be at the temple, and they'd be making sacrifices once a year, all these things. But they have all this other stuff going on too in Judah. And so 1 Kings 14, verse 24 says, there's male cult prostitutes. Well, now that's a little different. That's not anything close to what God's asked about. And so these things have taken place. I mean, it's just one thing bad after another. Now, as you keep going down, chapter 15. Chapter 15, we have Abijam, and he ends up being king. But if you look in verse 3, he's the next line after Rehoboam. But is he a good guy or a bad guy in verse 3? Yeah, his heart isn't with God. It's not fully there. And so that ends up being a bad situation. And in verse 5 it says, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, when he talks about Bathsheba and talks about killing Uriah. Everything else, that's the only thing God had against him. But all these other people is bad. It's real bad. And so now, all of a sudden, as it gets to verse 11, Asa is next on scene. Now, is he a good guy?
Yeah.
Okay, he's a good guy. In verse 12, it talks about what he does away with. He does away with the male prostitutes and removes all the idols that his fathers had made. So now it's talking about his dad, and that's talking about his grandfather. Now, it's tough to not follow in the steps of your dad, because it's a lot of influence. Your parents hold a lot of influence. The older you get, is there anybody that starts having some different quirks about you that you thought, I'd never do that, and you start doing that? Well, the other day I noticed what I was doing that my dad does. He does it. He does that thumbs up, kind of puts his lips together. And I did that the other day to a kid. And I was like, that's my dad. How many things do we do? You can see your mannerisms, how you do things. Your parents have a big influence, don't they? Now think if you have an ungodly set of parents. How difficult is that? That's pretty tough, right? And so he's going against all that. It says He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He did away with these things. He did away with the idols, away with the prostitutes. And look in verse 13. He also removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen. That's a big deal. I mean, he takes his mother away because you're not fit to be queen. I'm sorry, does it say grandmother? Mine said mother. Yours says grandmother? I might have to look at the original text and see what that's referring to. I need to probably look at the... Well, mine does say mother, so I need to look back at the lineage and see, who the wife was of who to determine that. Verse 13. So he removes her. That's a big deal. He takes her out of the way and says, no, you're not worthy of this, because this needs to be a person who's godly. And she's removed. But in verse 14, there is one caveat there. What is not done? The high places aren't taken away. So what that would be, you would have different areas, elevated areas, where you would have altars, and they would make sacrifices there. Where's the one place they're supposed to make sacrifices by the law of God? It's supposed to be in the temple. That's it. And see, that's the difference between the synagogue and the temple, right? Synagogue is a place where they would sing and they would pray, they would read, they would do these things. Looks more like a present day church worship service. But they do not sacrifice in the synagogue. They do that in the temple. And so they knew, and who does those? Who does the sacrificing? The Levites, right? The priests from that tribe, not something else. So you wouldn't have these high places set up. So that's the one thing he doesn't do. So, yes? Yes. All right, so then that would be going back to the original text then, right? So verse 13 is the word mother indicates from the Hebrew grandmother. So thank you very much for that. So now, it's pretty interesting, Asa, because look in, we talked about and look in verse 14. Now, I want you to go to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 16. And these 4 books, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, really are paired well together. And you can see some things. Now, this I think is pretty interesting here. And this may be the one of the last things that I'm able to get with. But look in chapter 2 Chronicles chapter 16. Look in verse 7. Now, what happens is Asa decides to go up and strike a deal with Israel. And when he does that, in verse 7, he strikes a deal with him instead of seeking God's help. And it says, because you relied on the king of Syria and did not rely on the Lord your God, the armies of Syria have escaped you. And so he tries to make a deal, and they escape. And then, so he doesn't seek his good then, and then later on, he gets so mad in verse 9. It says, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole place to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. You have done foolish in this. From now on, you will have wars. Then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in stocks in prison, for he was enraged with him because of this. And Asa inflicted cruelties upon the people at the same time. All of a sudden, he's losing focus. He's not the man he started off to be. If you look in verse 12, the 39th year of his reign, he ended up having his feet were diseased. And who did he not seek? He's gotten so far removed from God, he doesn't even ask God for help. It's on his own. And so knowing that, and that's where we'll stop today. But no matter what, we need to make sure we're asking for wisdom, because that's going to keep us searching for God and asking counsel for him to give us counsel instead of taking the advice of everyone else. And that's what we've seen so far is everybody else, the advice they've gotten has not been good because it hadn't been godly because of the people they've associated themselves with. Thank you.